Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Thank you. Let us pray. God of mystery and clarity, open our eyes to see the unexpected ways you come to us. Lord, reveal to us your presence in the beauties of nature, in the promises of sacred scriptures, and in the challenges that deepen our dependence on you. Make clear your plans to our lawmakers and infuse them with confidence in your power. Inspire them to use their talents as instruments of liberation and healing. Lord, keep them purposeful and expectant, so they will experience a deeper friendship with you in the living of their days. We pray in your abiding name. Amen.
Please join me in the recitation of the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic thereof, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Sir,
you made it.
I made it.
Made some ice cream.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii to be Director.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa is recognized.
For the third time, I come to the Senate floor to ask my Democrat colleagues if they'll respect the Democrats on the Senate Agriculture Committee. That committee voted unanimously to approve Mrs. Rollins to be Secretary of Agriculture, and there should be no reason to spend 30 hours of debate, and it would show disrespect for the Democrats on the Agriculture Committee not to approve her unless we did it by unanimous consent. On another point, the champions of the 59th Super Bowl will celebrate with a parade in Valentine's Day in Philadelphia. I can say with pride that the state of Iowa is celebrating this victory with Cooper DeJean, a hometown hero and former Iowa Hawkeye. On Super Bowl Sunday, he made history on his 22nd birthday in his rookie season with the Philadelphia Eagles. Cooper grew up in the northwest Iowa farming community of Odebolt, population 985. He was a four-star varsity athlete in high school, competing with the Odebolt, Arthur, Battle Creek, Ida Grove Falcons. From Odebolt, he went to the University of Iowa, becoming a two-time All-American cornerback. Last year, Cooper was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles. As you would expect, his hometown had a watch party on Sunday. They called it Cooper Bowl, and boy, did Cooper shine. He had a thrilling 38-yard pick six in the second quarter. Cooper made Super Bowl history, becoming the first player to intercept a pass or score a touchdown on his birthday. The young man from Odebolt was spotted entering the Superdome in New Orleans. You know what? Wearing his high school Letterman jacket. He also had a 712 to 215 printed on his cleats, and homage to his hometown area code and his new Philadelphia area code. So, congratulations, Cooper. You're a role model for young athletes to dream big and put in the work. A small-town kid from western Iowa made history and made all Iowans proud. We look forward to watching you shine for many years to come. I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Resume consideration of the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, to be Director.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa is recognized.
for the third time, I come to the Senate floor to ask my Democrat colleagues if they'll respect the Democrats on the Senate Agriculture Committee. That committee voted unanimously to approve Mrs. Rollins to be Secretary of Agriculture, and there should be no reason to spend 30 hours of debate, and it would show disrespect for the Democrats on the Agriculture Committee not to approve her unless we did it by unanimous consent. On another point, the champions of the 59th Super Bowl will celebrate with a parade in Valentine's Day in Philadelphia. I can say with pride that the state of Iowa is celebrating this victory with Cooper DeJean, a hometown hero and former Iowa Hawkeye. On Super Bowl Sunday, he made history on his 22nd birthday in his rookie season with the Philadelphia Eagles. Cooper grew up in the northwest Iowa farming community of Odebolt, population 985. He was a four-star varsity athlete in high school, competing with the Odebolt, Arthur, Battle Creek, Ida Grove Falcons. From Odebolt, he went to the University of Iowa, becoming a two-time All-American cornerback. Last year, Cooper was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles. As you would expect, his hometown had a watch party on Sunday. They called it Cooper Bowl, and boy, did Cooper shine. He had a thrilling 38-yard pick six in the second quarter. Cooper made Super Bowl history, becoming the first player to intercept a pass or score a touchdown on his birthday. The young man from Odebolt was spotted entering the Superdome in New Orleans. You know what? Wearing his high school Letterman jacket. He also had a 712 to 215 printed on his cleats, and homage to his hometown area code and his new Philadelphia area code. So, congratulations, Cooper. You're a role model for young athletes to dream big and put in the work. A small-town kid from western Iowa made history and made all Iowans proud. We look forward to watching you shine for many years to come. I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President, is the Senate in quorum call?
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, President Trump's border czar was at the Capitol yesterday to update Republican senators on the progress the administration's making on arresting and deporting criminals here illegally. And it's difficult to believe some of the individuals they've arrested were still in the country. Members of violent international gangs, individuals arrested for murder, for rape, for kidnapping, for drug trafficking, for sexual crimes involving children, and for human smuggling. Again, it is staggering to think that these criminals were out there on our nation's streets. and our communities will be safer places without these individuals. Mr. President, since day one of his administration, President Trump has been fulfilling his campaign promise to crack down on illegal immigration and secure our border. And it's good to see. Immigration is a key part of our country's story, and immigrants have made untold contributions to our country. But we need to ensure that immigration is done legally for both the safety of our country and to preserve respect for the rule of law. The chaos of the last 4 years was unsustainable, and it was dangerous. We had 10 million individuals flood across our southern border. We had millions of undocumented individuals take up residence in our country, more than the population of a number of U.S. states. Law enforcement officials were overwhelmed, and officers were pulled off of the essential work of guarding the border just to process the flood of migrants. Border cities and other cities across the United States struggled to deal with the influx. And all of this chaos was an invitation to terrorists, to smugglers, to drug cartels, and other dangerous individuals to enter our country. And so I am tremendously proud and grateful for the incredible amount of work the President has done so far to make it clear that illegal migration will no longer be tolerated. But Mr. President, there's a lot more work to do. And some of that's going to require Congress's help. Mr. Holman, President Trump's border czar, made clear to senators yesterday that Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are going to need additional resources to continue the good work they've been doing to secure our border and to get criminals off of our streets. And we intend to deliver. Today, Senator Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, is kicking off the committee markup of a budget resolution that will lay the foundation for a transformational investment in border security and immigration enforcement and in our national defense. We will provide resources to increase the number of immigration and customs enforcement officers and Border Patrol agents, expand detention space, facilitate deportations of dangerous individuals, and obtain the barriers and technology that we need to secure the border. Mr. President, for too long, our country has tolerated rampant illegal immigration. That ends now. I'm grateful for everything the President is doing to protect our streets and uphold the law, and the Republican-led Congress will ensure that the administration has the resources needed to continue this important work. Mr. President, in a few minutes, we're going to be voting on a couple of nominees. The first one is Tulsi Gabbard to be the director of the DNI. The second one will be a cloture vote to proceed to the nomination of Bobby Kennedy to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, what I observe that's interesting about both of these nominees is that both are former Democrats. In fact, a year ago, they were Democrats. I would argue they've seen the light, they've become Republicans, and now they've been nominated by President Trump to fill important posts within his administration. But I make that observation only because there's a lot of talk these days about loyalty oaths and allegiance and saliva purity tests for people to be considered, good enough to be in the so-called MAGA movement, in other words, the Republican Party. And yet, when it comes to Democrats, a very different standard seems to be being applied here. Because both of these people were former Democrats. In fact, frankly, they probably agree with the Democrat Party here in the Senate on a lot of the positions that they hold. And yet, they had the temerity to come out and support positions that perhaps ran contrary to some of the positions held by particularly the progressive wing of the Democrat Party in this country. In the case of RFK, coming out for some positions that run counter to the orthodoxy of the healthcare so-called establishment. Or in the case of Ms. Gabbard, different views perhaps about national security matters than those held by a lot of Democrats, certainly here in this chamber and in the progressive movement in the country. And it harkens back to two other Democrats who pretty much got pushed out of their party here in the United States Senate for holding views that ran contrary to the majority view of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party. Those two Democrats were Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. In the case of Kyrsten Sinema, she was viewed, I think, by Democrats as perhaps too free market. She was viewed as pro-business, as pro-investment, and as pro-jobs, lighter regulatory touch, lighter tax policy, pro-energy policy. In the case of Joe Manchin, he had I should say he had what I would say are accurate views with respect to energy development in this country. In other words, making America energy dominant, a view shared by many in our party, including our president. And for that, he was viewed as too conservative to be a true Democrat. And so Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema ended up getting pushed out of the Democrat Party here in the United States Senate. Now, their ultimate cardinal sin, however, in the case of Manchin, as I said, he was pro-energy in a party that is dominated by climate, green, all those, however adjectives you want to use to characterize or describe it. His views ran contrary. In fact, he tried to cut a deal with the Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act, only to find out that they kind of went back on him, and the deal wasn't what he thought he had agreed to. So his views were out of the mainstream of the Democrat Party, as were Kyrsten Sinema's. But their cardinal sin, Mr. President, their cardinal sin was that they voted against getting rid of the legislative filibuster, a view that was held by, up until just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats here in the United States Senate. There was a letter signed, which I shared the other night, had 32 Democrat signatures on it, pleading with the leadership here in the Senate not to abandon the Senate tradition and heritage with respect to the filibuster, to maintain the heritage and the tradition that the Senate has for open debate and for representation of the minority, for the requirement for collaboration and bipartisanship when it comes to moving consequential legislation. Those are the things that the filibuster traditionally was about. And up until a few years ago, most of my colleagues on the other side, a majority on the other side, signed a letter articulating their views that that ought to be the position of the United States Senate. Well, they tried to push it because they weren't getting the outcomes they wanted on a couple of pieces of legislation when they had the majority a couple of years ago, and they forced a vote on changing the rules, breaking the rules, to get rid of the legislative filibuster and be able to enact an agenda that's more consistent with their liking. There were two people that voted against it on their side, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And for that cardinal sin, they were essentially ostracized. And to this day, Mr. President, the Democrat Party continues to hold a position now, very contrary to the one they held just a few years ago, about getting rid of the legislative filibuster. And why do they want to do that? Because they want to enact an agenda, a progressive leftist agenda, which the American people voted against in November. And as recently as last summer at the Democrat convention, the Democrat leader basically laid out the things they want to do. First, he said, we're going to get rid of the filibuster because we have the votes now. Manchin and Sinema are gone. I've talked to the Democrats that we think we're going to elect, and we're going to have 51. And at that time, he was predicting a clean sweep. They were going to win the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they would get rid of the legislative filibuster, and the first thing they would do is they'd federalize our elections in this country. That was the first thing they were going to do. And then they said they were going to enshrine abortion rights in law. That was one of the things they were going to do. There have been many on their side who have talked about packing the Supreme Court, about allowing statehood for Puerto Rico and for Washington, D.C., all elements of the agenda that they want to accomplish through getting rid of the legislative filibuster. That was articulated by the Democrat leader as recently as the Democrat convention last summer. Intentions that they had to get rid of the legislative filibuster so that so that their party is in control, that they could do the things that they wanted to do, that they felt that the American people were asking them to do. Well, it turns out there was an election between last summer and now in which the American people spoke otherwise. And they had a very different view than the Democrats on a whole range of issues. Issues on which I think the left and the Democrat Party is completely out of step with the American people. Not the least of which is allowing boys to play girls' sports. That's a 90% issue with the American people. The House has passed legislation on it. We will vote on it at some point in the future. And I just can't imagine, and I speak as a dad of daughters who were both female athletes, one of whom is in her high school and college Hall of Fame. I don't know how anybody, and this is where I say, I think that there's just a certain intuitive common sense the American people have. And they voted for that and made that abundantly clear in the election this last fall. And so I say that, again, just to remind people, when you hear this perspective about how Republicans don't have any room for dissent, they all got to be in lockstep. Believe me, we got a lot of dissent on our side. Try leading the Republican conference. The Democrats, on the other hand, you have a dissenting view, particularly on something like the filibuster. Sorry, you're out of here. And so, Mr. President, today, it's ironic to me that we are going to vote on two nominees, President Trump's nominees, to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services and to be the Director of National Intelligence, who are former Democrats. And I will be surprised. I would like to be surprised. But I don't believe that there's going to be a single Democrat that votes for either of the two people who less than a year ago were members of their party. In some cases, members of their party that goes back decades. The Kennedy family, Democrat politics in America. So you have two nominees who were Democrats a year ago, but because they articulate views now or demonstrated dissent from the ideology of the Democrat Party, are no longer can get even one Democrat to vote for him here on the floor of the United States Senate. Now again, I'm hoping to be surprised. That vote's going to happen in about 30 minutes on Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence. And then shortly after that, we'll have a cloture vote on Robert F. Kennedy to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In each of those cases, you got Democrats in good standing, as recently as a year ago, who have been pushed out, come now, they're nominees by President Trump for positions within his administration, and you're not going to see a single Democrat vote for them. But we will confirm them, and we'll get these people into these positions as soon as possible. And answer, I think, the mandate that was given by the American people in November, and that is they want a different track in this country, a different direction. They have a different set of priorities than is being articulated here on the United States Senate. Mr. President, we also had just recently a vote on Laken Riley, and that was probably the most glaring example, again, of Democrats' willingness to filibuster, something they wanted to get rid of 2 years ago. They want to get rid of the legislative filibuster. We get the majority. First time we put a bill on the floor, what do? They filibuster it. And so here we are, slowing down these noms, full 30 hours on Tulsi Gabbard. I assume they'll do the same thing on RFK. But these are people that are going to be confirmed and going to begin working in this administration to implement the agenda that the President of the United States has articulated and the one that he carried to the voters in this last election, in an election in which the voters gave him a decisive majority at the polls. And so, Mr. President, I hope, again, that I'm wrong. I hope that we have a bipartisan vote today on either or both of these nominees. But I will tell you that based on my assessment of where the party is, the Democrat Party in this country, it will come as a great surprise to me if that's the case. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Democrat leader.
Mr. President, let me begin with a quote from President Trump during his campaign for the presidency. He said, "When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one." Well, today is day 23, and prices are up 3%. Let me reiterate. Donald Trump said during his campaign prices would come down starting on day one. It's day 23, and prices are up 3%. Donald Trump is already breaking his promise to the American people. Inflation is the #1 concern of most Americans. And Donald Trump said he'd fight inflation, but he hasn't. Groceries are up 0.5%. Chicken, pork, steak are all more expensive. Egg prices are up 15% from last month. Gas prices are up 2% from last month. The price of used cars are up. The price of heating your home is up. Housing costs are through the roof, even though Republicans are racing to privatize Fannie and Freddie. Well, welcome to the age of Trumpflation. Donald Trump is breaking his promise to lower costs. This was the #1 issue in the campaign to most people. And Donald Trump said, starting on day one, prices are going to start coming down. Well, they're up 3%. It's day 20. Welcome again to the age of Trumpflation. Donald Trump knows that he doesn't have real solutions to bringing costs down despite his campaign promises. So what is he doing? He's distracting and diverting the American people, or trying to, with issues that have nothing to do with bringing prices down. He's distracting and diverting with issues like changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, talking about changing the chairman of the board of the Kennedy Center, talking about building hotels in Gaza, talking about the Panama Canal, talking about annexing Canada. These are not the things Americans signed up for. No way. If there's one mandate Donald Trump had, it was to fight inflation on day one, like he promised to do. But he's not doing that. He's focused on everything else except what Americans want most. Meanwhile, Americans woke up this morning to bad news for their bank accounts. They woke up to a grim reality that Donald Trump is not going to keep his promise to lower costs. They woke up, Americans woke up to an era of Trumpflation, and unfortunately, this is only the beginning. On DOGE. We all agree, I've said it many times, that cutting waste in government and increasing efficiency is a good thing. But what DOGE is doing is something else entirely. DOGE is taking a meat axe and attacking vital programs indiscriminately. Of the programs that he cuts, some may be wasteful. Many clearly are not. Cut now, says DOGE, ask questions later. Meanwhile, of course, Trumpflation continues to get worse. If Donald Trump and DOGE want to focus on efficiency, they should do it as the Constitution maintains and the founders wisely prescribed, through Congress. The founders knew we needed debate, we needed sunlight, we needed transparency, so we can see what programs can be improved or changed and what should be maintained. Instead, DOGE is taking a meat axe and cutting vital programs that virtually no one outside of DOGE would call wasteful. Cut now, ask questions later. I was in Albany and Syracuse on Monday visiting community health centers. These centers throughout the country, CHCs as they are known, community health centers, are among the most effective and efficient users of government funding. And they rely on federal dollars to provide high-quality, affordable health care for working people, far cheaper than when people would show up at a hospital. They're particularly important in rural areas where people have no options. But many of these community health centers have had their funding cut temporarily, and too many are still unable to access funding. Some have even had to close. That means many working people suddenly have no option for high-quality, affordable health care near them. Is this Doge's idea of cutting wasteful spending, taking among the most effective, efficient parts of the healthcare system that deliver costs to people that deliver healthcare to people who need help with lower cost? Cut it without asking a question, without examining what community health centers do? Meat axe. Meat axe. That's what they're doing. Or let's look at programs like PEPFAR in the AID program. Again, they want to cut the whole AID. But what about PEPFAR? Do people at Doge even realize what PEPFAR does? It helps combat things like AIDS. It has saved 25 million lives. Other programs stop things like Ebola in Central Africa. If Ebola is left unchecked, it could one day spread to America, from Uganda to around the world today. There are flights from Kampala all over the world. So even if you oppose foreign aid on a policy ground, most people believe that PEPFAR and the programs fighting Ebola in Central Africa are effective and cost-effective and make us more secure. God forbid Ebola would spread to the United States. You want to see what government waste looks like? It doesn't look like those two programs. Thanks to Doge, here's what government waste looks like that Doge has created. Thanks to Doge, $500 million in food assistance through USAID is sitting in ports and ships and warehouses unable to move. And so the bottom line is simple. If you want to make cuts, you have sunlight, transparency, debate in Congress. Not lawlessness, not breaking the law because you feel, well, you know more than anybody else. Not by implementing cuts and asking questions later. It's a formula for disaster when you do things like that. These policies will hurt children, they'll hurt seniors, they'll hurt veterans, and so many other of our friends and neighbors. On reconciliation. Today, Senate Republicans' scheme to pass tax cuts for the ultra-rich takes the next important step. Later today, Chairman Graham of the Budget Committee will hold a markup of the Republicans' first reconciliation bill. Republicans claim that their bill will be fully paid for, but that means Republicans are laying the groundwork to gut things like nutrition assistance, funding for nursing homes, student debt support, and to kill clean energy jobs that employ Americans in red and blue states alike. There's been so much focus on how Republicans are going to pass their signature bills. Should it be one bill? Should it be two bills? At the end of the day, talking about process is a sideshow. This one bills, two bills, or 100 bills is meaningless. What they're trying to do is give tax cuts to the very wealthy, further tax cuts to the very wealthy, who are doing just fine. And they're hurting average Americans by cutting programs, again, meat axe, slashing across the board to do it. They could carve up their bill, they could carve up one bill, two bills, five bills, as I said, it doesn't matter. They could carve it up in their agenda however they want. They could change the order of policies they tackle first. But the end game does not change. This is all about clearing the path to cutting taxes for billionaires and making the American people foot the bill. The whole thing, the whole big enterprise is aimed with one goal in mind: tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, large tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, who, as I said, they're doing fine. Not as fine as the average American who just saw their inflation go up 3%. Plain and simple, again, what is their plan? Funnel more wealth to the ultra-wealthy while slashing everything else to the bone. Gutting Medicare and Medicaid, yanking school lunches from kids, blocking prescription drug reforms which make drugs cheaper for the average American, cutting funding for cancer research, one of the most popular things we do, cutting research for semiconductor manufacturing, letting China get ahead of us. No matter how they dress it up, no matter what spin they can put on it, Republicans' agenda boils down to this: tax cuts for the wealthy, deep, painful cuts for everybody else. And finally, on the nomination we're about to vote on in a little while, the Gabbard nomination. Every single Democrat, I am proud to say, will oppose the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, because we simply cannot, in good conscience, trust our most classified secrets to someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for conspiracy theories. So before my Republican colleagues cast their vote to confirm Ms. Gabbard, I hope they're going to think carefully one last time, because America's safety, America's security is at stake. Is Ms. Gabbard really who Republicans want leading intelligence agencies? I'll bet not. Is she the best person we could find for the important position of Director of National Intelligence? Of all the people who know the intelligence world, I know some will be conservative like Donald Trump would want, but they wouldn't have the huge question marks about them that Ms. Gabbard has. Do Republicans truly believe, I say to my colleagues, that someone who has so carelessly and repeatedly echoed Russian propaganda and sympathized with the likes of Putin and Assad is the right person for this job? I ask my Republican colleagues to think about the safety of the American people and the concern of our allies and the threats posed by Vladimir Putin before casting this vote. Objectively, I think most senators would agree there are better choices to lead national intelligence. You know what my guess is? If we had a secret ballot, Gabbard might get 10 votes and 40 against her from the other side. People know. That's why they raise so many questions. But Donald Trump and Elon Musk evidently threaten them, and they're changing their view. The Director of National Intelligence must be strong against America's adversaries. This is an amazing one. How could we put someone in when you hear about this? After Assad used chemical weapons against his own people in 2017 and 2018, Tulsi Gabbard turned against U.S. intelligence. By the way, at that point, Donald Trump was president, and sided with fringe conspiracy theorists to cast doubt on these two specific incidents. I want to be clear about how strange and troubling this episode was. On one side, you had the entire U.S. intelligence ecosystem, the intelligence system of the French government, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, all saying the same thing, that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people in 2017 and 2018. The findings were not speculation. They were based on satellite imagery, witness accounts, medical experts. In other words, the kind of intelligence data that Ms. Gabbard would be responsible for evaluating if she, God forbid, gets this job. On the other side of all these experts and all this evidence, fact-based, you had Tulsi Gabbard relying on the judgment of an individual who had appeared on Russian-funded propaganda outlets, questioning those findings, shielding Assad for his inhumane conduct. I have to say, I have never heard of a DNI nominee who was so ready and willing to question the findings of America's own intelligence operations and yet accept Russian disinformation so easily. And of course, I'm troubled by her long record of showing weakness against Russia when it came to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. On the night Russia invaded Ukraine and launched the first full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation in Europe since World War II, what was Ms. Gabbard doing? She was on Twitter at 11:30 p.m. blaming NATO and the United States for starting the war in Ukraine when Putin invaded Ukraine. She said the war could have been avoided had NATO and the U.S. just accommodated Putin. That's who we want as head of national intelligence? By the way, Russian state TV gleefully aired these comments shortly thereafter. And now Republicans want to make this person the top U.S. intelligence chief. Can you believe it? I really don't believe my Republican colleagues believe she's the right choice. I really don't. I know the pressures that have been placed upon them. There's word in the newspapers and other places that people were told their elections would be opposed, etc. Who knows? But we do know that there was tremendous pressure on Republican senators. But sometimes, my Republican colleagues, you have to buck and stand up to the pressure and say, no, this is the wrong choice, definitely the wrong choice for America. And again, I'd repeat, if there was a secret ballot, I would bet that Gabbard would get no more than 10 votes in the Senate. 10. Maybe. So the nomination of Ms. Gabbard is one of those moments. So again, before Republicans cast their vote to confirm Ms. Gabbard today, please, please, please answer one simple question. Do you care more about doing the right thing for our national security or doing whatever is necessary to keep Donald Trump happy? I yield the floor.
President.
Majority Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just heard the minority leader, the senior senator from New York, Senator Schumer, on this floor talking about today's consumer price index data. And stunningly, he points to President Trump as the reason for it. Now, let me just correct the record, Mr. President. The price data that Senator Schumer is complaining about is from the final days of the Joe Biden administration. Those are the numbers that are out today. The final days of the Biden administration. And certainly everyone in Wyoming and everyone in your home state in Oklahoma knows that under the Biden administration and the Democrats, prices of goods and groceries, gasoline, the things that we need in our everyday life, prices rose more than 20% under Joe Biden. High prices are Joe Biden's parting gift and his lasting legacy. They were the party of open borders and high prices. That's why they lost the election. So here we have the Senate minority leader, now in the minority, used to be in the majority. The reason he's in the minority is because of the high prices brought on the people of this country as a result of that administration, and the numbers out today are reflective of the final days of that administration. Painfully high prices. They came from Democrats' reckless overspending and their policies. And we're from energy states that was anti-American energy policies. Those are the things that Senate Democrats voted for repeatedly and stood behind and supported. Republicans are focused on making life more affordable for families all across this country, hardworking families. And we have a plan to unleash American energy. And that way, we can keep lowering prices for American families. I just can never forget when Joe Biden said he wanted to prioritize climate over energy that was available, affordable, and reliable. It was a disaster for the country and resulted in defeat of the Democrats. Today, Mr. President, I come to the floor also to talk about confirmation votes. And the Senate will soon vote on the confirmation of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. America needs to be healthy. I'm a doctor, worked with patients for over 20 years, as a surgeon in Wyoming. The problem is our nation faces a chronic disease epidemic. Chronic diseases, including diabetes, cancer, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, chronic diseases. They are so widespread that managing them accounts for almost 90% of the federal health care spending in this country. And we spend a lot of our gross national product on health care. Nearly 3 in 5 Americans, adults, and 1 in 4 American children are impacted by this. Our healthcare system tries to address the problem, but yet by incentivizing procedures over prevention and paying for that, well, it often fails to address what we need to do effectively as well as economically. As a result, Americans are actually becoming less healthy. We need to put America on the path to good health. President Trump has selected Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to do just that, to make America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy will bring a fresh set of ideas and eyes to important debates surrounding our nation's public health. He's going to be a voice for the vast number of Americans who were failed by the previous administration. The previous administration silenced reasoned debate. I believe that Mr. Kennedy is going to deliver accountability and transparency. For Americans, that means more choices and better information. It means healthy foods and healthy competition for patients. It means lower costs and higher quality. It means increased access to care. Access is so critical in my home state of Wyoming, with so many rural and frontier communities, people long distances from health care. It also means honest, unbiased, and trustworthy scientific research that is both innovative as well as accountable to the American people. People want the truth. They want to know what the facts are. They want to make their decisions then for themselves. Look, this is Mr. Kennedy's bold vision to revitalize America's Bill of Health. He's very clear about his mission, has been throughout. His mission, as he told the Finance Committee, is to end the chronic disease epidemic and make America healthy again. Apparently, that's not enough for the Senate Democrats. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, she was actually dismissive of him at the Senate Finance Committee. I heard her say to Mr. Kennedy, "So that's the only reason why you're at HHS, to address this one issue?" This one issue, chronic disease epidemic that is plaguing our nation, is the key issue to our health care. Respectfully, addressing chronic disease is what we ought to be talking about for health care for the people of our country. You know, Mr. Kennedy had to testify and did testify before 2 separate Senate committees as part of his confirmation. Most people being confirmed and coming to the Senate only testify at one committee. He responded to rigorous questions from both Republicans and Democrats, and he answered those questions with candor and with clarity. He told the Senate Help Committee that his leadership approach was collaborative. He pledged to empower the scientists to do their jobs, not to impose, as he said, preordained opinions on anybody at HHS. He was also clear that he supports vaccines. He told the Finance Committee, "I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS Secretary," he said, "that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking those vaccines." The Senate has every reason to take him at his word. Mr. Kennedy is a bold choice. He is pro-health, pro-vaccine, and pro-transparency. He's the right choice to make America healthy again. I look forward to voting to confirm him. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Virginia.
I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for 6 minutes, followed by Senator Wyden for 5 minutes, Senator Crapo for 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes prior to the scheduled vote.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise once more to oppose the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. As I've said repeatedly, I have great respect for Ms. Gabbard's over 20 years of service to our nation, both in and out of uniform. I am, however, profoundly worried that she lacks the qualifications or judgments to be DNI. The job of the Director of National Intelligence is not a duty to be taken lightly. The incumbent serves as the principal intelligence advisor to the President and also bears the weight of responsibility to prevent another 9/11. The DNI must also represent the tens of thousands of intelligence professionals who around the world often toil in anonymity. They serve as America's first line of defense against terrorists, transnational criminals, and adversarial nations who wish to do us harm. And she must also represent America to our allies as a trustworthy partner. Unfortunately, through her own words and actions, Ms. Gabbard has demonstrated she is not up to the task. She took the word of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad against the assessments of our own Department of Defense, State Department, and intelligence community when she claimed that, and when she denied that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. She knowingly met with a Syrian cleric who was vocally threatened to conduct serial bomb attacks against the United States. She sought to blame the United States and NATO, for Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. She publicly praised and defended Edward Snowden when he compromised our nation's most sensitive collection sources and methods, then ran off to hide in China and Russia. Those compromises put at risk not only our intelligence, but our men and women in uniform in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And just last week, even with repeated inquiries from her Republican colleagues, she refused to call Snowden a traitor. Now, speaking of China, when asked about TikTok at her confirmation hearing, she refused to acknowledge the threat posed by China owning a social media company that reaches 170 million Americans. And all the way up until she was nominated to be DNI, she publicly advocated for the wholesale elimination of FISA 702. 702 is a tool that we use actively in the intelligence domain, a tool that contributes literally 60% of the information that makes up the President's daily brief. That daily brief, which will also fall under her responsibility, should be confirmed. The environment facing a new DNI today is complicated and fraught with challenges. Not only had the traditional threats persisted, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but we've seen an increased threats from terrorism, cyber actions, and transnational criminal organizations. All the while, the intelligence community itself is under attack. Some of our most senior and experienced law enforcement and intelligence professionals are being asked to take political litmus tests. And those who are seen as insignificantly loyal are being fired or forced to resign. Whole agencies are being eliminated and funding impounded in flagrant defiance of the Constitution, which only gives the Congress, us here in this body, the power of the purse. And unvetted, unqualified individuals illegally burrowing into classified and sensitive information, this very action jeopardizing our national security and violating Americans' privacy. These Doge Bros seem to have no restriction on them at all, and I've seen no evidence that Ms. Gabbard is prepared to deal with this onslaught. Therefore, I must oppose her nomination and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a moment, the Senate will proceed to a cloture vote on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I rise to encourage my colleagues to support this motion. As Secretary of HHS, Mr. Kennedy would oversee our nation's expansive health care system, from sources of coverage to advancement of public health. Mr. Kennedy's decades of experience and deep drive to advocate on behalf of consumers will set a patient-centered tone at the department. As he has demonstrated in both public and private settings, Mr. Kennedy is committed to reorienting our healthcare approach and restoring faith in our institutions. His passion for addressing America's chronic disease epidemic will save lives, reduce costs, and establish a foundation for a healthier, stronger country. His dedication to transparency will empower patients to make more informed decisions about their health care and form a responsive rapport with Congress. As Mr. Kennedy stated during his hearing, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately. Over the course of his vetting process, Mr. Kennedy met with dozens of members on both sides of the aisle, spoke with bipartisan Senate Finance Committee staff, appeared before 2 committee hearings, and answered over 900 questions for the record, not to mention presenting thousands of pages of documents. Mr. Kennedy has gone through the same Office of Government Ethics process as all nominees who come before the Finance Committee and has received support for his efforts. Similar to all other nominees, we have a letter from the Director of the Office of Government Ethics stating, based thereon, we believe that this nominee is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest. He even amended his ethics agreement, going beyond what was required by the Office of Government Ethics in response to the request from one of our Finance Committee members. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this nomination so we can begin to make our country healthier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Should I do it or not?
President.
Democratic leader.
I know I spoke a little while ago on Tulsi Gabbard, but I feel so strongly I just wanted to make one last plea to my Republican colleagues. In a moment, the Senate will vote to confirm Tulsi Gabbard as the next Director of National Intelligence. Every single Democrat, I am really proud to say, will oppose this awful nomination because we simply cannot, in good conscience, trust our most classified secrets to someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for conspiracy theories. It's hard to believe, of all the talented and capable people, that this is the person nominated. It's a person who has said things like the Ukraine invasion was caused by the United States, not by Putin. It's somebody who has denied Assad's use of chemical weapons despite all of the intelligence. It's someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for crazy conspiracy theories. I'd say to my Republican colleagues, please think once again about this nomination. This endangers our security. And my guess is, if a secret ballot were cast on Tulsi Gabbard, maybe she'd get 10 votes. You all know how bad she is. And so I know that people feel they want to please the president in his nomination. But there are certain times you have to buck and stand up and say, no, this is just a very bad choice for America. And the nomination of Ms. Gabbard is simply one of those. I plead with my colleagues, I know it's the last minute, to think twice, to vote no, as we all will vote, because this is such an awful nomination who will endanger our national security and our intelligence operations throughout the country and the world. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
I rise to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be the
Senate quorum call.
Vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And let me put it very bluntly to my colleagues. A vote for Robert Kennedy for this position is a vote for a sicker America. And there's irony in that judgment, considering Mr. Kennedy is the figurehead of a mass movement known as Make America Healthy Again. But on issue after issue, Mr. Kennedy refused to stand up for policies that will keep Americans healthy and out of the hospital. From vaccines to affordable health insurance to lower drug prices to women's reproductive health care, Mr. Kennedy, through several hearings, ducked and dodged and weaved instead of answering the basic questions that came from senators of both parties. When he did answer, he demonstrated a shocking lack of knowledge about the federal health programs he'll be charged with running and a willful desire to mislead senators about his views on science matters like vaccine safety. The only conclusion I'm left with is that he stands steadfastly by the outlandish views he's expressed over his two-decade career as an anti-vaccine crusader, and he's fully prepared to implement the Republican health care agenda. That agenda boils down to putting big pharma and insurance companies back in charge while leaving millions of American families to fend for themselves without affordable care. And I want to be clear about this. Going back to my days as director of the Gray Panthers, which is what I did before I went into public service, I can just tell you, Mr. President, this is the least qualified nominee to ever be nominated for a position of this importance. So for the next day and night, Senate Democrats are going to be out on this floor telling the American people why. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle still have an opportunity to turn away from a dangerous path. If they do not, my view is their legacy will be tarnished by setbacks in science that will echo in America for decades. As I mentioned, I spent countless hours as a young man working with seniors to navigate the newly created Medicare program and help them avoid predatory insurance company tactics that remain all too common today. To me and many other Americans, healthcare, colleagues, is the most important issue, because if you and your loved ones don't have their health, everything else goes by the board. And the reality is, we need to make sure that Americans have the best and most affordable health care possible, rather than having a handful of health care companies being gobbled up in the entire market for health insurance, pharmaceuticals, hospitals, and even doctors. The results have been great for shareholder profits and disastrous for American families. Costs keep climbing. The act of getting a doctor's appointment or filing an insurance claim seems to have become an Olympic sport in much of America. The system delays and denies care and rakes in profits while patients are left wondering how they're going to get the care they need. So the question before the Senate now is whether we want America's chief health officer to be somebody who's going to take on those corporate interests, somebody who's going to fight tooth and nail to lower costs and improve care, somebody who's going to work to protect and improve the federal health care programs that tens of millions of Americans rely on them, and not gut. Everything I've seen and heard from Mr. Kennedy over these last few weeks has led me, colleagues, to conclude he is not the person that America needs. Americans have little reason to take Mr. Kennedy at his word. They do, however, have every reason to believe Mr. Kennedy will continue to embrace and amplify anti-vaccine programs. Every reason to believe is he will back up Donald Trump's abortion bans, and every reason exists to examine the prospect that he'll be a rubber stamp for the Republican health agenda that would rip away the health care of so many Americans. Over the next 24 hours, Democrats are going to show the American people why these concerns are so serious. I yield the floor, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this nomination.
Right now. All time has expired. The question occurs on the Gabbard nomination. Is there a sufficient second?
There appears to be.
There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran,
Jim, are you still going back and forth every day?
No, I spent the night last night here. And,
Mr. Moreno,
back and forth enough.
Mr. Mullen,
Too much.
Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Grassley, Johnson, Justice, Lankford, Moran, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tillis, Tuberville. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Coons, Hassan, Heinrich, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Peters, Schumer, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Wyden. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Murkowski, Aye. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett. No.
It's like a fine enough state.
Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley. Aye.
Okay. Yeas are 52, nays are 48. Nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately notify of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President, I move,
Order, Leader.
I move to waive the mandatory quorum with respect to the Kennedy nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion and invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. A quorum is present. The question... What you want to do? The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Ono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. I did not, thank you. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane.
No, yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thanks. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Capito, Kramer, Curtis, Fisher, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Collins, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Thank you. Also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Coons, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Slotkin, and Smith. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Hirono, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important to America, I thought I would just mention the conversation I had recently with a couple of young medical students who came up to me and said, you know, we know you're interested in health care and have been involved in this, and I'm so appreciative of Senator Murray, who's going to pick up on the health care issue, an area where she has very substantial experience and expertise. And I thought these medical students summed up this debate, because they said, the way we see this Kennedy nomination, it's not just a vote for next week or even next year. This is a vote with enormous impact for decades, because Mr. Kennedy, according to these young students, these young medical students, has a long record of essentially being anti-science. And what we're going to do in our discussion of his nomination is go into that and other issues. And suffice it to say, during his confirmation hearings, and they've been in multiple committees now, he was given ample opportunity from members on both sides of the dais to clarify his views on science and vaccines and our nation's biggest federal health programs. And we're going to, in the hours ahead, touch on each of these and why Mr. Kennedy's failure to demonstrate a basic understanding of these important issues that impact America's health make him a uniquely unqualified nominee to become our nation's chief health care officer. And in beginning my remarks, Mr. President, I wanted to say that ever since my days with the Gray Panthers, I've always felt that health care is the most important issue. If you and your loved ones don't have your health, everything just goes by the board. So that just reinforces what these young medical students were saying about the decision we're going to make in future hours with respect to Mr. Kennedy. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most dangerous aspect of his long history, and that's his embrace and amplification of vaccine conspiracy theories. He's made a lucrative career out of sowing doubt in the minds of parents when it comes to vaccinating their kids. His, quote, nonprofit, the Children's Health Defense, is solely dedicated to peddling these conspiracies. You can even get merch. There are baby onesies, apparently, that read unvaxxed, unafraid, no vax, no problem. He's been the attorney of record on at least 5 cases against drug companies for their vaccines, which he didn't disclose to ethics officials and refused to answer questions about. He also refused to give up his 10% stake in any settlement agreements, instead passing them off to his son. And he refused to recuse himself from taking any actions that might affect his family's financial interest. A vaccine that has become routine for young people about 20 years ago is involved here, and since then it's successfully cut cervical cancer rates into just a fraction of what they were before the drug came to market. All of this adds up to a future HHS secretary who stands to profit off undermining this vaccine and as a result raise cervical cancer rates. To quote my Republican colleague, Senator Cassidy, a physician, Mr. Kennedy is financially vested in finding fault with vaccines. He also played a big role in one of the most deadly measles outbreaks in recent history. In 2019, he traveled to Samoa and used his platform to promote his anti-vax agenda, taking aim at the measles vaccine. The vaccine rate in Samoa plummeted. By 2019, measles had torn through the entire population, making more than 5,700 people sick, and 80 people were killed, most of them young kids. During his confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about those 83 deaths. But just last week, the Director General of the Health of Samoa called this claim by Mr. Kennedy, and I quote here, "a total fabrication." So, Mr. President and colleagues, just put that in your thinking about this consideration. Mr. Kennedy saying that he didn't know what was killing these young people in Samoa, and the Director General of the Health of Samoa called Mr. Kennedy's claim a total fabrication. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in the last 4 years where he took anti-vaccine views or spread misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines. In 36 of these instances, Mr. Kennedy directly linked vaccines to autism. Instead of providing the committee with clarity or reassurances about his decades-long career peddling of vaccine conspiracies, what did Mr. Kennedy do? He dodged, he weaved, he bobbed, and gave no indication that as Health and Human Services Secretary, he would stand by settled science that surrounds vaccines. As HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy would have a huge amount of control over how vaccines are promoted and administered in our country. He could issue orders that discourage doctors from sharing information with parents and patients about life-saving vaccines. He could issue an order that discourages schools from talking about or even requiring vaccines. He could rubber stamp an executive order from Donald Trump that defunds the Centers for Disease Control, which is essentially the agency in charge of getting Americans up-to-date information about vaccines and when to get them. Just imagine you're a parent scrolling on Instagram or listening to a podcast. You hear this gentleman speaking passionately about the danger of vaccines. Maybe you do a bit of research, and lo and behold, you find this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, America's chief healthcare guy. You think to yourself, this guy must know what he's talking about. Maybe he's right when he's questioning if vaccines are safe and effective. So the seed of doubt on vaccines gets planted. And then at your kid's next wellness exam, you decide not to get them their next round of vaccinations. A few months later, you're taking them on a trip to Disneyland, say for spring break, where countless other parents like you have heard the same medical advice from the same person, and you too decided against vaccinating your kids. It only takes one of those kids carrying a deadly disease like measles for an outbreak to begin. And pretty soon, after what was supposed to be the spring break trip of your dreams, your kid, sadly, is showing symptoms. What follows then is a slew of doctor's appointments, maybe even a stay in the hospital, sleepless nights, missed days of work and school, not to mention dread and fear for your child's very well-being. Meanwhile, countless other parents around the country that went on the same trip to Disneyland are now experiencing the same exact nightmare you are. Sowing the seed of doubt in the minds of just a few people can have massive consequences for communities across the country. And it is not hypothetical. Right now, there's a measles outbreak in Texas that's sickened more than a dozen kids. The number of kindergartners showing up with an exemption for required vaccinations jumped to a record high last fall. The two facts are connected, and Mr. Kennedy and his allies can take the credit for it. Now, Mr. Kennedy is fond of saying he's not making recommendations about whether parents should vaccinate their kids. He's just asking questions and giving people choices. That's a slippery tactic used by conspiracy theorists to dodge any real responsibility for their words and actions, and it's absurd coming from somebody who's about to be confirmed for a job that is entirely about making recommendations. Mr. Kennedy is also fond of saying that if somebody shows him the science to prove he's wrong, well, then he'll apologize and retract his statements. But when somebody does show him the science proves him wrong, he just brushes it aside and basically will not accept it as fact. Once again, to quote my Republican colleague Bill Cassidy directly, to improve the health of Americans or undermine it, always asking for more evidence and never accepting the evidence that's there. That's why Bill Cassidy told Mr. Kennedy he was struggling with his nomination. So even Republicans like Senator Cassidy, someone I work with frequently on the Finance Committee and respect his opinion, he knows how dangerous this guy is. And it is not hyperbole to say that when Mr. Kennedy becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, if he does, and has control over how our government rolls out vaccines or make them available, I believe kids in America will die. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and hospitalizations and death tolls mount, my Republican colleagues are going to regret voting, if they do, for Mr. Kennedy today or early this morning. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country and death tolls, mount, again, we will see Republicans say, this is something that could have been prevented. What else should we have done? Republicans will be responsible for every child that dies as a result of not being vaccinated, because it seems they care more about staying in the good graces of Donald Trump than they do about protecting the lives of kids. Again, this is something they will regret for years to come. Now, before we turn to Senator Murray's remarks, I'd just like to touch on Mr. Kennedy's stance on reproductive choice, an area where Senator Murray has been our leader for years and years in the Senate. In the lead up to and during his failed presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy repeatedly claimed he supported a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Less than a year ago, in an Instagram post on June 14th last year, he stated that he supports the emerging consensus in this country that abortion should be legal up to a certain number of weeks. Fast forward to his confirmation again at the Senate Finance Committee a few weeks ago. He was pressed repeatedly by Democrats about his stance on abortion. Instead of clarifying, Mr. Kennedy defaulted to a clearly rehearsed talking point that he repeated over and over again. Quote, I agree with President Trump. Every abortion is a tragedy. While that answer doesn't give us much clarity, it's certainly telling. Mr. Kennedy has a long history of changing his stance on health care issue after health care issue to whatever position benefits him at the moment, as long as it earns him power or it earns him a paycheck. As far as I can tell, Mr. Kennedy will believe, or at least pretend to believe, whatever you want him to. He's willing to give up his principles and all of his beliefs that women and mothers are better equipped to make their own health care decisions than politicians. And it's all about, as we've talked about on this floor, staying in Donald Trump's orbit of power. While Mr. Kennedy recites rehearsed talking points on the subject, this is an issue that has had real, deadly consequences for women, as Senator Murray has said again and again. Donald Trump spent his first term packing the Supreme Court with right-wing extremists willing to rip away the reproductive freedoms guaranteed to us under Roe versus Wade. In the wake of the Supreme Court's gutting Roe, millions of women living in red states have had their reproductive freedoms ripped away from them, all due to Donald Trump. In the years since the overturn of Roe, there have been countless headlines about the consequences of these abortion bans. Women bleeding out in parking lots or in emergency rooms because they were denied care. Women becoming infertile and losing their ability to have kids in the future because they couldn't get care. And in the very worst cases, women dying. So it should horrify every American that we don't actually know where Mr. Kennedy stands. The man who could become our nation's chief health care officer, we don't know where he stands on reproductive health, short of perhaps just saying he's a yes man for anything Donald Trump tells him to do. So I think at this point, Mr. President, I want to yield the floor to my friend and colleague from Washington State, because she knows so much about the challenge of ensuring that women's reproductive health services are being protected. And as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mr. Kennedy could do so much damage to the well-being and health of women, and I'm very pleased to be able to yield the floor to her to discuss that and other pressing issues.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleague from Oregon who has very clearly stated why this nominee is not someone who should be holding the title of Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I appreciate all of his work on this and his wise words. I hope everyone heeds them. Mr. President, the American people are watching now with alarm because the vast majority of people know vaccines are safe, they're effective, they are life-saving. But we are now on the verge of confirming as our nation's highest health official, a man who has spent considerable time, money, and effort undermining that basic fact. A man who has abused his platform by refusing to acknowledge the well-established science that shows that vaccines are not linked to autism. Fear about that point, fueled by RFK Jr. and others peddling misinformation, is a leading reason that parents do not get their kids vaccinated against preventable, dangerous diseases. That is why elevating a man like RFK Jr. to lead HHS would be so dangerous. Just giving him any platform to spread vaccine doubt is dangerous, but to give him one of the biggest megaphones in the world, it is truly shameful that we even are debating this. My colleagues should know better. They actually do know better. They are looking the other way. They are choosing to pretend like it is in any way believable that RFK Jr. won't use his new power to do exactly the thing he has been trying to do for decades, undermine vaccines. Never mind the fact that CDC has already modified web pages with information about vaccines and other vital public health information, which a federal judge has now ordered the Trump administration to restore it. Never mind that the Trump administration is also reportedly planning widespread and significant layoffs at CDC and across HHS. This is how RFK Jr. substitutes his own beliefs for science. So when the vaccine conspiracy starts swirling and RFK Jr. turns HHS into ground zero for misinformation, I had no idea it is not going to be an excuse for confirming him, because at the Health Committee hearing, the chair pressed him repeatedly about the debunked claim that vaccines cause autism. And when RFK Jr. said he needed to see the evidence, he was shown the evidence. But to no one's surprise, he did not keep his word, admit he'd been wrong, and spread the good news that vaccines do not cause autism. He's had 2 weeks since that hearing to look at the same settled science as everyone else. Crickets. But he won't hesitate to quote the latest anti-vax conspiracy. He's totally up to speed on that front. Are my colleagues really buying this guy will take an impartial look at the science? If you think RFK Jr. will change who he is, you are lying to yourself. He has given no evidence to suggest that and all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Given his long and growing track record, we cannot just pretend if RFK Jr. finally gets power to undermine vaccines, a cause he has dedicated a considerable amount of time and effort to, that he'll just give up. That is not believable. And I know I've been talking a lot about vaccines because it is so obviously alarming. But the responsibility he would have goes far beyond that. So let's break some of this down. Both the ways he could undermine vaccines as HHS Secretary and the other responsibilities that would be at stake. To start with, the CDC is under HHS. That means that the Secretary directly appoints people to CDC's Vaccine Advisory Board. That board is responsible for making recommendations about vaccines, and it is those recommendations that determine whether or not certain vaccines have to be covered by insurance. So simply put, changing those recommendations will change what vaccines millions of Americans, including kids, will be able to get from their healthcare provider. If he is confirmed, there would be nothing stopping RFK Jr. from firing the entire board and replacing them all with vaccine skeptics. After all, he has said many times and in many ways, he thinks CDC is corrupt and bought by pharma, as usual, by the way, without any evidence. Would also oversee the Food and Drug Administration. That is another agency he has repeatedly tried to discredit and attack, where he says he plans to fire hundreds of scientists on day one, and an agency that plays the crucial role of making sure our drugs and our treatments, including vaccines, are safe and effective when we purchase them. Not only would Mr. Kennedy have a key perch from which he would undermine vaccines on a scale like never seen before, he could also use that platform to peddle quack treatments. No basis in science. RFK Jr. would also have jurisdiction over NIH. That alone means influence over billions of dollars in medical research, research that is responsible for a significant portion of our economy, and more importantly, research that patients are desperately hoping will help them find cures. But RFK Jr. could redirect those funds to promote his favorite pet conspiracies instead of promising cures. Or he could make good on his plan to fire hundreds of researchers and pause infectious disease research for 8 years. It should go without saying, viruses aren't going to take a break. And here's the thing, the attacks on medical research are now already happening under Trump. From his day one executive orders, President Trump has already been threatening medical research. Suddenly, all of our grants are at risk because they are looking at addressing barriers to care or understanding why Black and Native American women have higher maternal death rates. And now President Trump also is trying to illegally, arbitrarily, and suddenly change NIH guidelines to set an unrealistic low cap on indirect cost rates. That will mean researchers laid off, studies canceled, including life-saving clinical trials, and kids not able to get the treatment they need. All because President Trump and Elon Musk don't seem to understand how we actually fund important research. and couldn't even be bothered to find out before taking an axe to our medical research labs. At a time when life-saving research like this is already under attack from President and the richest man in the world, no one who truly values medical research should vote to install one of the biggest attackers of medical science as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mr. President, insurance is another huge portfolio for HHS. Last time Trump was in office, we saw millions of people lose their health care coverage. The uninsured rate went up after years of hard-won progress. And we all know he still wants to rip up the Affordable Care Act, which will drive up costs and kick people off their coverage. There's no reason to think Mr. Kennedy will stand up to that effort. Indeed, there is no reason to think he has the experience and understanding of the system to actually do so. During his committee hearings, RFK Jr. confused Medicare and Medicaid. This is basic stuff. He failed to describe the components of Medicare. And yes, Mr. President, I do absolutely have to talk about abortion care. This is of grave importance right now. In his hearings, not only did RFK Jr. confess to having no real understanding